Everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is David Gazai, and I am the Director of Member Service and Learning at Orchestras Canada, and my pronouns are he, him. I am a white male with brown hair, and I have a blurred background. Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à ce webinaire. Je m'appelle David Gazai et je suis le directeur des services aux membres et de l'apprentissage à Orchestre Canada, et j'utilise le pronom il. Je suis un homme blanc aux cheveux bruns et mon arrière-plan est flou. This meeting is being recorded. Today's session will be presented in English, but we are happily offering French live interpretation as well as interpretation for the American Sign Language and the langue des signes du Québec. Cette réunion est enregistrée. La séance d'aujourd'hui sera présentée en anglais, mais nous sommes heureux d'offrir l'interprétation en direct en français ainsi que l'interprétation pour l'American Sign Language et la langue des signes du Québec. If you would like to hear the presentation in French, I recommend you click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and pick the French version. We will be sharing links to presentations in the chat as they go so that you can follow in your language of choice. Si vous souhaitez entendre la présentation en français, je vous recommande de cliquer sur le bouton Interprétation au bas de votre écran et de choisir la version française. Nous partagerons les liens vers la présentation traduite en français dans le clavardoir au fur et à mesure afin que vous puissiez suivre dans la langue de votre choix. A few notes on ASL LSQ interpretation during the webinar. Make sure to have the speaker view setting turned on. Please note that ASL and LSQ interpreters will switch out between co-interpreter every so often by turning the camera on and off. You can move the video boxes around to reposition the interpreters for a better view. Do this by clicking, holding the mouse click, and dragging the interpreter's video box to the place that is best for you to view. Using live captioning during the webinar. In the bottom of the Zoom window, find the live transcript button, click the up arrow button next to the live transcript button, and then click on Show Subtitle to start displaying live captions. To hide live closed captions, click the up arrow next to the live transcript button and then click on Hide Subtitles. If you do not see an up arrow, try just clicking the live transcript button to see if the Show Hide Subtitle option appears. If Zoom fails, if you are experiencing any issues whatsoever with Zoom, we have emailed you and put in the Zoom chat a link to a YouTube stream. The stream will be only in English and we will be monitoring the chat there as well. Orchestras Canada is a virtual organization and we work from wherever we are. I work in Kingston, Ontario on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. I acknowledge this territory's significance for the Indigenous people who lived and continue to live upon it. People whose practices and spiritualities were tied to the land and continue to develop in relationship to the territory and its other inhabitants today. I will now pass the mic to Catherine Carlton, our Executive Director.
Thank you so much, David. It's wonderful to be here today with you. Now, as disruptive as the pandemic has been for so many people, it has also galvanized collaboration, creativity, and generosity. This webinar and its predecessor last week embody these qualities, and I'd like to thank some people. First of all, the Arts Service Organization partners who agreed that better access to insights on audiences was imperative, then took the lead on organizing these webinars and jointly funding the costs of interpretation. My sincere thanks to our colleagues at the Association for Opera in Canada, Business and Arts, the Canadian Dance Assembly, CAPACOA, Choral Canada, the Professional Association of Canadian Theatres, the Regroupement Québécois de la Danse, the Toronto Alliance for the Performing Arts, and the entire team at Orchestras Canada. I'd also like to pay tribute to the public and private funders who stepped forward to invest in high-quality research and analysis and who are equally committed to ensuring that the research results are broadly available. I'd like to shout out Arts Council England for their support of the Audience Agency, the Ontario Arts Council for their support of the Ontario edition of the Audience Outlook Monitor, and the visionaries coordinated by Business and Arts who invested in the Art Audience Response Tracking Survey, the National Arts Center, David Binet, Christine Armstrong, and Irfan Raji. Thanks to all of them. Finally, I'd like to introduce and thank today's host, Dr. Taiwo Afolabi, Canada Research Chair in Socially Engaged Theatre, the Director for the Centre for Socially Engaged Theatre, and an Assistant Professor at the University of Regina, as well as our presenters, Alan Brown, Managing Principal of Wolf Brown, Émilie Bossard from Nanos Research Group, and Elise Boileau and Oliver Mantell from the Audience Agency. My gratitude to all of them. Thank you so much for being here. And over to you, Taiwo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's an opportunity and a privilege to be hosting this with everyone today. My name is Taiwo Afolabi. I'm dialing in at the Center for Socially Engaged Theatre, situated on in the University of Regina. It's in Treaty 4. It's homeland to the Michif, Anishinaabe, Nakota, Dakota, and the homeland of the Michif and Michif nations. It's a privilege to be having this conversation today, and I'm hoping that we're all going to be having a great time talking about what really matters to us around audience and really performing arts in Canada. What are audience telling us? We all know that central to discourse, central to the practice, central to the art and all that we're doing in performing art is audience, whether from programming to the relevance of art to focusing on entertainment and fun, and everything hinge on the audience, whether how we engineer or re-engineer, how we understand their behavior, how we evaluate, how their impact also affect the box office. Just think about everything. It hinges on the audience. So our panelists today, they're going to be presenting to us some of the research that they've done that will be offering us insight into culture goers, into their behavior, particularly post-pandemic. I will be, the presenters, we look into the research that they've done. And then from there, as a way to get us started, we start asking ourselves questions based on this research that will be shared with us today. What are audience telling us? Whether from programming to the change and the twist in behavior in their theater-going culture or theater-going culture, everything that we can see from those research, what can we get out of that? Please feel free to type your question in the chat box. Each presenter would have 7 minutes to make their presentation, and after that, we open the conversation up to really engage with your questions. We will start our presentation today with Oliver Mantell and Elise Boileau. I hope that I'm pronouncing that name correctly. My apologies if I did not pronounce it correctly. And they'll be presenting on cultural audiences now from the cultural participation and audience finder. And they are from the Audience Agency. After that, we'll move to culture goers. And after that, we move to culture goers are 3 times more likely to say they intend to spend more rather than less on art culture in 2022. And that's going to be a presentation from Nanos Research. And finally, we're going to go into the third presentation, Performing Arts in Canada, what our audience are telling us. After those 3 presentations, we open things up onto Q&A, and then looking forward to that conversation. So over to you, Oliver and Elise. Thank you so much.
Lovely, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me nice and clearly. I'm Oliver from the Audience Agency. My colleague Elise is with me, but I'll do the initial bit of chatting. There's Elise on camera there, and so then we'll get both take part in the Q&A bit. What I'll be doing is trying to summarize, I guess, like everyone else here, huge amounts of research over 2.5 years in just a few minutes. So forgive me if I gloss over some little bits of it. But in essence, I'm going to be talking based on two different types of information. On the one hand, we'll be talking using the Cultural Participation Monitor. So that is a large-scale, nationally representative survey that we've been running through the pandemic since October 2020, and are continuing to do that into the future. The purpose of that survey is to really get a view of the whole population and what they're doing, what they're thinking, and give us a wide context to arts engagement as well. So that's the sort of survey-based for the whole population. Then we've also got transaction-based, so ticketing-based information from Audience Finder. Now, Audience Finder is huge. It has 680 plus organisations feeding data in terms of ticketing data, but we're looking particularly at a particular subset of that. So 100 organisations that we've got nice, consistent data all the way through, all coded nicely and all nice and neat. So we can look at changes in audience behaviour from before the pandemic to after the pandemic, particularly looking at May, June as a kind of standard snapshot. The other thing I will refer to just occasionally on the way through here is our audience segmentation model called Audience Spectrum. I won't dwell on that in too much detail. I'll mention particular segments at various points where there's a particular thing to raise, but in essence, it divides the whole population into 10 groups, of which 3 are, broadly speaking, highly engaged in culture, 3 are, broadly speaking, moderately engaged in culture, sort of medium engaged, and then there are 4 lower engaged groups. And we'll see through the pandemic and into the future that different groups are behaving very differently. So, what have we found out? Well, to tell the story in sort of simple terms, I've essentially got one sentence, albeit quite a long one, and one chart to share with you. So, here goes. So, what we have found is that, of course, COVID reduced engagement when things were closed. More notably, it also continued to reduce engagement once things had opened up. And it did that in ways which varied for different types of people. So as we saw during COVID, whenever there was a little window of time when people could go back to attend, or indeed as things first opened up, we saw most activity most quickly from groups who were young, who were family groups, who lived in urban areas particularly, and of course also people who didn't have a disability, because of course disability is linked to risk from COVID. Conversely, we saw both at the time, but also persisting, a reduction in the opposite groups. So older groups, non-family groups, groups that are based further out, and indeed people with disabilities. So lower engagement from those groups, it seems to have carried on. And for certain art forms in particular, that can have a really long-term impact. Of course, the tide did start to turn. So as of about last autumn particularly, we started to see a kind of a steady crawling back, both of people's willingness to attend. So, since then we've seen roughly doubling of the proportion of people who say they're happy to attend things for whatever reason, but also actual attendance levels. So we can see where we tracked sales figures a really kind of clear glide upwards. A little bit sort of ruffled around last Christmas, where we had the Omicron variant causing some difficulty. But essentially, it broadly speaking risen and started to come back to at least around previous levels come last sort of late spring, early summer this year. Now, we say it's got back to similar levels, but what we have seen, and I think there's already a question in the chat that touches on this, is huge volatility in the actual attendance numbers at individual organisations. So lots of organisations are outside their usual bounds for attendance, but for some of them, that's because they're over, for some it's under. And there are some patterns, outdoor arts is doing really well, but often it's really quite a mixed picture. So anyway, attendance came back, it was looking positive, and of course then we had the cost of living crisis, and that's the thing that is really dominating attention at this point. So our last wave of the participation monitor, we saw So this is from sort of late September, beginning of October. Really large proportions of the UK population saying that they were worried about the cost of living crisis and its impact on their households. So sort of 86% I think worried, almost half of people saying they're very worried. And they were also telling us that was going to have knock-on effects. They were going to go out less, they were going to do less cultural things, they were going to try and cut down their spending in all sorts of ways. And culture was one of the things that they were most likely to cut down on their spending in as an area. And it affects certain groups more than others. Now we saw, obviously going into COVID, there's quite a lot of difference in terms of affluence in society. And during COVID, it was often the least affluent groups who were most negatively affected. By the time we sort of got past the lockdown stage of COVID, so we've seen that about 40% of people are saying they were already feeling worse off. Then the cost of living crisis comes along. It again hits lots of the same people who are most affected. And also for various reasons involving mortgage payments and various other things, interest rates, it's also affecting families a lot. So what we're seeing is that younger people, families, those in urban areas, and of course those in general less well off, are most affected by the cost of living, and that's becoming really prominent as an issue. So people are saying, yes, they'll spend less, they'll probably attend less often, more than maybe cut down spending each time, but it's easier to cut down frequency. And I think that'll have all sorts of implications for what happens for arts and culture, and indeed which things thrive or don't. So people are also talking about attending more locally, sort of closer to home for a variety of reasons, partly to do with lowered horizons because of COVID, and partly to things like fuel costs. The key thing really here is that it seems to be targeting particularly those groups who otherwise were coming back post-COVID. So we've got this sort of effect where one half has been affected by COVID, and that's the shadow of that, and the other half is being affected by cost of living. So just finally, to show you this summary chart, without getting into all the detail, beyond flagging that again we had high was orange, medium was yellow, and lower engaged was blue, we can see that particularly focusing on the vertical axis here, the groups that were above the line, so some groups that had got back to pre-COVID levels of attendance. If we then look at who's most affected by cost of living, it tends to be these groups that are all above the line. And all of these three groups I've highlighted there tend to have quite high proportions of families in them. So the family audience that was coming back in large numbers is going to be particularly affected by the cost of living crisis, and also the one high engaged group that was above average. So if you like, from the UK perspective, that's the picture we're seeing, and that's the challenge we're seeing, and I'm sure we'll talk more about the implications of that in a second. So that is it from us for the time being. And so I think we're now handing over to Emily from Nanos Research from a Canadian perspective.
Yes, hello everyone. Let me just share my screen. Perfect. So hopefully everyone can see my screen and can hear me clearly. So my name is Emily, and I work for Nanos Research, and I'm very happy to present the latest results of our arts tracking survey today. So the results I'll be reporting on today are from our latest survey done from September 30th to October 3rd, and it was about 1,000 Canadians. Now I'll be reporting on what we consider culture goers. So out of that sample of 1,000 Canadians, I'll be reporting on those that reported attending an indoor or outdoor activity prior to the pandemic. And that's about 820 out of those 1,000 Canadians that we consider culture goers. And just to mention that the study was conducted by us in cooperation with Business in the Arts and the National Arts Centre. Perfect. So let's start with the expected timeline to return to art and culture events. So as we can see, over half of culture goers reports haven't gone back to the arts since the pandemic. So 57% for indoor art, 64 for outdoor, 56 for museum and galleries. So we saw a bigger increase for outdoor performances. So as we can see, it almost doubled from May to October, which is, to expect with the summer months and more outdoor performances available. And you have about a bit over 1 in 10 that say that they're going to wait to go back. They have a set date, whether in a month, 3 months, 6 months, but they have a date when they're expecting to go back in mind. And then you have about a quarter, so 24% of culture goers that are still unsure when they're going to go back. And finally, we noticed a difference with young culture goers. So they were more likely to have reported to have gone back to all the activities, especially the outdoor performances. So we can see in our latest wave, 76% of young culture goers, so 18 to 34 years old, reported having gone back to outdoor performances. Now, what are the precautions needed to feel comfortable attending an indoor art or cultural performance or a gallery or museum? So we can see the top precaution needed to feel comfortable are masks. So for those that, especially those that are planning on waiting or those that are unsure when they're going to return, we can see masks is the top precaution. And then at about 1 in 10, you have precautions such as hand sanitizer, smaller capacity, social distancing, and everyone getting vaccinated were all mentioned by indoor culture goers. And then you have over 1/3 of those that have already returned that, or those that plan on waiting, that say they don't need anything particular to feel comfortable, so they're comfortable going back as is, and they mentioned that they didn't need any specific precaution to feel comfortable. Now, when we talk about motivators for attending in-person events, we asked this question specifically for lapsed culture goers, so those that hadn't gone back to the arts since the COVID pandemic. And we can see that the top motivator would be something interesting and fun. So about 4 in 10 mentioned that would motivate them to go back to the arts. And it's about a 7-point increase if we compare that to a wave that we conducted in May 2022. And then you have about 1 in 10 that mentioned discounted events or lower prices. Same about 1 in 10 that say that there's nothing that would motivate them, they're not interested, or they wouldn't attend. And finally, a bit under 1 in 10 said enforce masks, which we saw a drop of 10 points when we compared that to the 17% that we saw in May 2022. So something interesting and fun, and that's the top motivator for those lapsed culture goers. Now, we also asked a couple questions on donations and spending for arts and culture. And let's start off with donations. So we can see that the amount culture goers expect to donate remained about the same in 2022 as 2021. So about $140 is what they expect to donate on average. And the proportion that say that they will donate also remain steady. So 30% in 2021 and 31% in 2022. So very similar trends in both those years. Now, when we ask them about spending to attend an art or cultural performance, we ask them if they intend to spend more, less, or about the same. So we can see that the preferred was about the same. So 4 in 10 say they intend to spend about the same for arts and cultural performances. About 3 in 10 intend to spend more, and about 1 in 10 intend to spend less. So what we can gather from that is that they're more likely to say they're going to spend more rather than less in 2022 than they did in 2021. And if we combine the same and more, so you have about over half that will spend at least about the same, if not more, to attend arts and cultural performances in 2022. And finally, we asked the question on their ticket purchasing preferences. So how much in advance they prefer to purchase tickets. And we asked before the pandemic what they preferred and currently what they prefer. And we can see that prior to the pandemic, you had over a third that preferred up to 6 months in advance, and about 3 in 10 up to 1 month in advance. So purchasing tickets, at least 1 month in advance was the preferred option for culture goers, and a minority preferred in the upcoming week or last minute. Now, when we compared that to the numbers for current preferences, we can see a drop from 37% to 28% for those that prefer up to 6 months in advance, and a slight increase in those that say that they prefer in the upcoming week and at the last minute. So we can see a slight shift from pre-pandemic preferring to purchase tickets very well in advance to now still preferring very well in advance, but there is a slight decrease and a slight increase in preferring up in the upcoming week and last minute. And we also saw a difference for Quebec residents. So Quebec residents were more likely to say that they preferred purchasing tickets well in advance, both for before the pandemic. So they had 49% that preferred up to 6 months in advance pre-pandemic, compared to the 37% for culture goers in general. And even currently, Quebecers are still more likely to prefer up to 6 months in advance. So overall, Quebec residents are just preferring to purchase tickets well in advance and more than culture goers overall. And so finally, just to close it off, so you have about a bit more than half of culture goers that have gone back to the arts and the culture, but still have about a quarter that are unsure when they will they're unsure when they will go back. And you have masks that remains the top precaution for those that are willing to wait to go back to feel comfortable. And those that haven't gone back yet, their top mention as a motivator was something that's interesting, something they're interested in, and something that's fun for them to attend. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily and Oliver, for your excellent presentations. I'm Alan Brown, principal of Wolf Brown, and I am coming to you from the Motor City of Detroit, Michigan, where I live. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity to be with you today to take stock of all the research over the last 2.5 years and really make sense of where we are, this complicated moment in time, and really look forward and ask ourselves, where do we need to go from here? So I have just a few charts for you, but mostly thinking about sort of big picture, what's happening and where do we go from here? Boran, next slide, please. I've been running the Audience Outlook Monitor COVID-19 study for the last 2.5 years. We started in May of 2020 and have gone monthly deploying surveys to ticket buyer lists through participating organizations. At one point, we had over 650 organizations participating. In our partners in Canada were the Ontario Arts Council and PAC, the Professional Association of Canadian Theatres. And I want to thank our Canadian partners for maybe some of you were participated in either of those cohorts. Believe it or not, we're deploying this last wave of surveys in December. So I actually have data from just last week. But this really was a different kind of study. We'd never done a longitudinal tracking study. We realized we had to do it. And I'm just going to show you 2 charts. The next slide. This is a question asking people, how comfortable would you be attending the following types of cultural facilities? The upper line, the darker green, is an outdoor festival or concert. And the lower line is a large theater or concert hall. Of course, those things move in tandem. You can see the difference between an outdoor venue and an indoor venue has been with us. You're looking at the last year and a half of data here. You can see Delta, you can see Omicron, you can see the post-Omicron variants. And we're on a little bit of an upward trend this month, but comfortability has never gotten back to very comfortable. And this is just an indicator in the long run that we're kind of coming out of the pandemic and not everyone yet feels comfortable. Next slide. And this is just a question we've been asking for the last couple of years is, when do you think you'll return? And as we move through time, of course, we have to keep changing the months because time moves on. And you can sort of look at the brown columns over time. And way back in February of last year, most people were not out yet. That began to improve. Then it improved dramatically around a year ago. Took a bit of a dip in January of this year, which was the Omicron. Then things improved. Things got a little worse, and now we're sitting at 83% of people, or 17%, who say I'm not yet ready to go out still. I would never expect everyone from some frozen moment in time to say they're ready to go out, but we're still looking at a persistent small group of people who are still not comfortable going out yet. And the 83% of those who are going out, this does not speak to their frequency. And of course, what the other speakers are showing is that their frequency is not what it used to be. Next slide, Moran. So I just want to review with you what all the confluent factors that I think are contributing to what we're seeing now. And I just want to preface this by saying I think it's dangerous to make wild generalizations about all arts organizations. I think results will vary by marketplace. Those of you in large urban areas may have a different experience than those in suburban areas or rural areas or small cities. And I think results also vary by discipline to some extent. But what we're seeing in the US is sales are down anywhere from 20% to 40% below pre-pandemic levels. The figure in Scandinavia is 33%. I don't know what it is in Canada. I think it varies, and it varies, of course, from program to program. But we know from our data that older folks are more sensitive to COVID infection. Some of them are still worried about going out to get about getting COVID, and that's still preventing some of them from going out. But it's not the dominant barrier at this point. It's one of several factors. More people have difficulty planning in advance. Also, the social context of going out for many people has been disrupted. And a social invitation is often the trigger for arts attendance. And when your friends are no longer going, you're lacking those invitations, and a lot of demand goes latent for lack of a social invitation. And I think that virtuous cycle of inviting has been disrupted by the pandemic, but it's impossible to quantify. Late planning, I'm beginning to wonder if we need some kind of an audience relationship that is a sort of late buyers club, where we actually create opportunities for people to buy maybe even good seats late because they can't decide in advance. And for years and years and decades, we've been trying to motivate people to buy in advance, and I think we need to re-examine that. Obviously, more people are enjoying digital programming. This is the legacy. One of the legacies of the pandemic is more people got comfortable with the amazing choice of excellent programming on television and commercial movies. At home, people understand they have options for staying home. There's still plenty of people who don't like digital programming. I'm not just talking about digital arts programming. That's a relatively small part of this, but commercial programming in general, particularly the proliferation of excellent drama on television. Next slide. More people are working at home. They're not going to offices that were perhaps nearby cultural venues. Perhaps that's a factor. It's impossible to quantify. I am hearing anecdotally from certain orchestras and theater companies in certain cities that safety concerns of audience members are a factor now more than they were. Meanwhile, the younger folks who are going out are watching their budgets now. And they are going out. What they're going out to is very interesting. Attendance at popular music concerts by major pop artists in arenas. Sales are brisk, vigorous. And I think Frédéric Julien, you asked an excellent question in the chat earlier. I think what we're seeing is a shift in tastes. Towards the more familiar, the more popular, the more sure bet programming, so that the more popular artists are probably selling better, and the artists who are a question mark or people aren't sure if they're going to enjoy it, there's less of incentive to go out. And this is maybe one of the more difficult legacies of the pandemic is that generational shifts in tastes, public tastes in art are constantly changing, and those changes have accelerated through COVID. And what we're seeing now is younger arts consumers who would be replacing older consumers are just interested in different kinds of experiences, more interactive, more immersive experiences. I won't even start yet talking about all the immersive programs that are out there. So next slide. Just wrapping up. I spoke about the trend towards more familiar, risk aversion. The explosion of commercial immersive entertainment is sucking tens of millions of dollars in demand out of many marketplaces, every marketplace. And what we've seen so far is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's coming. I just saw that Fever is rolling out a new Harry Potter immersive experience. That'll be in, I'm sure, every major marketplace. It's a new landscape. And what's happening, particularly in Las Vegas, in terms of the billions of dollars of investment by big commercial producers to create peak experiences, I just think more people are saving their money to have peak experiences less often and are less interested in going out to other kinds of experiences that they're not sure they're going to enjoy. So tectonic shifts. Let's go to the last slide. Where do we go from here? At least in the US, we had some federal relief money. Many of the larger organizations got millions of dollars in relief funding. That money is burning away, if not gone. And arts organizations are understanding they have to downsize or really change their focus. So I need to wrap up, but format diversification is probably something we should have been doing many years ago, offering people choices. If they come on Friday, they get a more educational format. If they come on Sunday, they might get a family-friendly format. Certainly looking at augmented virtual reality experiences, immersive products. This really is the creative future now for our sector. And we have a lot of R&D work to do. So I'll stop there and toss it back to Taiwo for the Q&A and look forward to your great questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Alan. Thanks to Oliver, to Emily, to Elise, and of course to Alan for your amazing just an overview of the research from the US to Canada, and of course to the UK. A lot of exciting conversation happening in the chat. So if you have questions, please drop it there. If you have any thought, drop it there. For I think participants are just really sharing the perspective in regards to returning to the art, motivation for labs, cultural goers, donation, spending, budget, programming, and all those kind of interesting ideas that that we have to talk about when it comes to to audience studies. Now, thanks, Alan, and I think I'm going to start a question from there, because Alan, you kind of just drop us on this great way of putting a caveat around cautioning us about the disparity in the result. We have to consider country-specific, culture-specific. We have to consider demography and all those kind of things. So I think I kind of want to start from there. There is a question here, I think two questions really, and anyone can take it really from the question. So Richard did write that we have had close to full houses for our orchestra, but I do not know other groups have, but I do know other groups have struggled. Groups that have a lower profile seem to be struggling more. We also had another comment saying Parkdale Orchestra and Ottawa Chamber Orchestra both had sold out concerts in November. These are volunteer community orchestras. Wondering if this points to other changes in the field that were not or that are not directly linked to COVID. And I think that's an interesting question that I wanted our panelists to weigh in. Are there other things we need to, some of these outcomes of this research that are not directly linked to COVID? Alan, you can start, or Oliver, Elise, and anyone can take it out. Let's do it.
I'll defer to Oliver.
Okay. Oliver, you're
Sure. Okay. Well, I was really interested to hear what Alan was saying about that kind of generational shift, partly because a little bit, before COVID, before we even knew that COVID was ever going to be a thing, we had done some research which suggested that there were quite different taste patterns amongst what one might call baby boomers, or older consumers relative to younger ones. And we had thought what was likely to happen over the next 10, 15, 20 years was that you'd end up with a kind of a peak of the sort of baby boomers, and then a risk at some point down the line where that group dropped off in terms of engagement. And that as a sector, there was a risk of us becoming very dependent on a group that then fell away, and we'd need to be ready for what that new future audience wanted. And one of our impressions from what we've seen through COVID is that it appears to have accelerated that shift. So we maybe didn't get as much of that peak as we expected. And then we've had a bit of a shift back towards the younger groups with different tastes. As Alan says, think about more kind of diverse formats, but also just greater variety of art forms, less loyalty, later booking, all those kind of things coming through. Where we have a slightly tricky moment right now, I think, is that because those groups are being hit by the cost of living particularly, we sort of, in a way, we've sort of got halfway through that painful shift where at least there was an upside and that we were going to be forced to be ready for the future. Whereas now we're slightly caught in a halfway house that it might be that to go fully into that future too quickly leaves us in trouble, but we can't really go back. But, audiences for the next 12 months or longer could just be really, really pinched from both angles. So I think there is that broader trend that that COVID has kind of pushed on. It's not, at least in the UK, I think, transformed the digital engagement so much. We thought that it might. We thought there was an opportunity, but organisations really had to scale back their digital activity once things started to open up again, and as a result, maybe that moment hasn't been captured. But yeah, I'd say that those are some of the key things initially.
Okay. Any other addition, Emily, Elise? Any addition to that? Okay, I'll just move to the next question. We have a lot of questions there that I'm hoping we can capture at least most of them in the next 15 minutes before we finish our conversation today. One of the things that you're also talking about, Oliver, is the idea of taste, particularly when it comes to demography and generation of audience. There is a question here that in our market, we clearly see a trend that people are looking for comfort food, safe, fun, all of that for cultural activities. How do we balance the quest for fun, entertainment, comfort with calls to address social justice in our programming? And again, this also speaks to taste of what audience want. And again, anyone can take on this, not necessarily Oliver, Emily, you can, Alan and Elise. How do we balance that? Because I think now we also have to think about programming and how that direct or do not, direct audience in coming in or going out.
I would say that in our discussions with arts organizations in the UK, we've seen that it's not only this sort of, I really enjoyed whoever said the term of comfort food to think about the types of programming. I thought that was very interesting, but it's more looking for a very special experience, a little bit like Alan was saying about the Las Vegas effect. So trying to put on something that's a bit more grand, a bit more special, unlike the kind of programming that would kind of cycle back more often. And so maybe there's a sort of clue in that people still want to be moved, they still want to be touched and be made to think and to reflect, but in a sort of a grander way, well, like with a grander experience and with them getting a feeling that what they're doing feels a bit more special and worth their time, worth their money when they're feeling quite squeezed. That would be my contribution to that.
Thanks, Elise. There is a question for Emily here. And I want us to, Emily, weigh in on this question because I'm going to come back to the piece around the hyperlocality of audience, particularly which we observed during COVID. But before that, Emily, this question here says that the percentages do not add up to 100% in the slide that you showed on ticketing, purchasing preferences. Can you help us make sense of these data points? And also, maybe you can also speak to, there are a lot of questions also around the last minute buyers, last minute takers that are also in the chat. Maybe you could speak to that, because I think there are also some contradictions here where there are last minute at the time, there are those that I have to, part of what you presented did say that there have to be a planning ahead. So maybe all of those gray areas, you could help us speak to that, Emily.
Yes, and if I'm just looking to the side, it's because I have the full report beside me, so I want to provide the correct stats. So to answer that question as to why the percentages don't add up to 100%, there are two other responses that we didn't include on this slide, which is they did not purchase tickets and that they were unsure. So those percentages, that's why it doesn't add up to 100%, because we didn't include those two responses on the slides. But if I want to report on that, so we can see that before the pandemic, there was about 10% that reported they did not purchase tickets. And then if I'm looking at after the pandemic or currently, there's about 15% that say they're not purchasing tickets. So it's a pretty consistent number. So we didn't see too much of a change in of those that aren't buying tickets. But when it comes to purchasing tickets in advance, so it is true that there was a decrease in those that prefer buying it up to 6 months in advance, up to 1 month in advance. But if we look at the numbers, it's still the preferred option. And we have to remember that the data that I'm presenting is culture goers in Canada. So if some organizations are seeing different types of numbers with their members, it might be because they're more a bit different than the culture goers in Canada that involves those that went to outdoor activities, like all the different activities, and might be as specified as that specific organization that might have members that have different preferences when it comes to buying tickets.
Thank you so much, Emily. I also want to come back. There's a question on the Canadian context, and this is from Frederic, that a member survey led by PACT found that smaller companies are facing worse than large companies with regards to their box office revenues. We also heard that the government of New Brunswick observing that venues are either full or empty, and there's no middle ground. These aren't just manifestation of COVID-related hesitancy. Sometimes something else might be at work. We're proposing here. Could these be symptoms of an algorithm problem? Search recommendation applications reinforcing popular choices and neglecting emerging and niche performing art offering? Are there other things that are at play here that we also need to consider? And again, this question is not only for Emily, it's for all of our panelists to think about. What are the other things that we need to start opening up this conversation to look into, to be able to help us to have a fulsome idea of what we're dealing with here? Alain, do you want to go?
I believe the economic term for what we're experiencing now is consolidation of demand. The marketplace is constantly aging. New generations are coming into the market that do not have experience with the arts. They have less experience, on average, less arts education. So their preferences are different. Their knowledge, they're not as able as their older counterparts to buy, for example, orchestra concerts based on repertoire because they don't know. So I believe what we're talking about is consolidation of demand. I think it's interesting, the algorithm conspiracy. I don't know what to think of that, Federic. I think we're certainly all getting suggested things like the things we've seen before, but the short answer is I think we as a sector have to figure out how to rebuild interest around adventurous art. Like, we need to tell people, hey, we want you to push the boundaries of your tastes and discover things maybe you don't know about or thought you might not like, and that's okay. And to kind of embrace and celebrate the idiosyncrasies of taste. So I'll stop right there, but I think that's like, we have to figure that out as a sector, not just individual organizations.
So Alan, to sort of to add on to that question, and again, Emily, Elise, and Oliver, you can respond to this. It seems we still have a lot of grounds to cover. Is our sector effectively, equipped for this? What are the things we need to start, structures and systems we need to start thinking about, resources that will help us to handle all of these realities? So, because it's from our conversation and existing research, where it's not just one straight answer. So, what are the resources that our sector that would help us to be able to, address all of these questions in a way that can move us forward? In addition to that, do performing arts marketers have all the resources they need to adapt to these new trends? I'll leave that at that. And I know that that's a big question, but I'm hoping that we can, shed more light on that, as much as possible.
Well, maybe I can just quickly add, I think we have to collaborate way more than we ever have on R&D. We need capital from institutional funders who also need to collaborate to fund the research and development that will bring exciting new products and programs to market that will attract a new generation of audiences. And in terms of resources, we need more resources, not just money, but support from service organizations to share. If we keep acting as in silos, we will never meet the challenges of this moment. We cannot keep operating as individual institutions thinking each of us is going to solve this problem alone. There's not enough capital. We have to come together in new ways.
Thanks. Oliver?
Yes, I mean, I think it's I mean, it relates to what Alan was saying, but I think we often talk about the need for structural change in the sector in terms of addressing particular social issues, and of course that's true, and it's important. But also, I think that same logic of kind of structural change is quite important to achieve all sorts of other outcomes. In the UK, we've just had the latest announcement from Arts Council England of the next 4 years of their funding portfolio and which organisations are included and not. And there's all sorts of choices within that which may be more or less controversial. But from my perspective, the thing that, if you like, the thing I haven't seen in that so much, or what Sherlock Holmes would call the dog that didn't bark, is we haven't seen a kind of transformation of the infrastructure in terms of platform organizations that enable some of that more digital collaboration. And so where we've seen through COVID, organizations trying a whole load of things, but ultimately having to fall back because they just don't have the capacity to specialize in it, or they don't have both the content and the platform and the reach to audience and the kind of technical skills in-house to X, Y, and Z, all simultaneously in a kind of integrated setup. That isn't going to happen organically. It kind of has to be, I think, enabled to happen by people actively making that change. And that's really difficult because structurally we're set up to have lots of small organizations based in separate places that cater to local in-person audiences. And once you've got that, if you're starting from there, it's quite hard to evolve to a model which is much more fluid and much more specialist around particular audiences and their needs wherever they are through whichever platform. So that's a real challenge. There was just one thing I wanted to throw in on the late booking question that's been going around, which is that Elise and I have just been looking at some data on late booking in terms of orchestral music in the UK. And what we have seen is, yes, of course, people booking later, but fewer people proportionately booking on the day. So it seems like people aren't booking long lead, but that kind of last minute spontaneous thing, maybe some of the heat's gone out of that as well. So you've got some interesting balance there. So yes, so just to kind of complicate that a little, but.
Thanks, Oliver, and we won't have time to unpack that. But I'd like Emily and Lisa to also, respond to the question. We only have 3 more minutes. And that's the thing with this conversation. In 1 hour, we're barely scratching the surface. Anyways, but Emily and Elise, I wonder if you can also respond to the question around, about how in what ways that can our sector really, address this trend? What are the things that we need that would help to really take on all of these new ideas that are coming our way, and how do we figure it out?
I'm going to give a very researcher's response, true to my profession, that we have to keep listening to our audiences and I absolutely agree, listening to each other and collaborating, but also keep doing the good work we're doing with all of these monitor surveys that are going on in all the different nations, keep listening to audiences first and foremost, and making sure we're in touch with them. That would be my grain of thought.
Thanks, Alice. Emily?
Yes, I think it would also be interesting for organizations to be able to compare their patron database to, culture goers, so you can see where there's a difference between, let's say, the general population of culture goers and your own patrons that, might vary in interest and age, might have different opinions. So you can kind of better understand the differences between why your patrons or clients are behaving a certain way, and it's not really, it's not really the same way as you can see with the culture goers, and trying to figure out where that difference is, where it's coming from. So having a better understanding of your patrons and also culture goers in general to see the differences might help you see where there's differences and what are the changes that need to be made, fit the culture goers, so you can attract more people to your organization. not just focusing on what your patrons are thinking, but also what the culture goers are thinking in order to attract more people to come to your organization, is what I would say.
Thank you so much. I know we're at 1 hour now. For the past 1 hour, we've been considering performing arts in Canada. What our audience telling us? And really what we've done is to give an overview of research from Canada, from the UK, and of course from the US. I want to acknowledge that a lot of questions in the chat on AI, on programming, on ticketing, on Patreon database, a lot of questions and a lot of chat happening. I do believe that our organizer will add all of this together and send the video and everything to everyone. Thank you so much to Alan, to Oliver, to Emily, and to Elise, and thank you so much, Catherine. I'll hand over to David now. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, and I'll hand over to David. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. This was great. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us today. It's been super informative, and I hope you also found that as well. We will be sharing the recording of both the English and French recording on our website shortly. We will also make the slides available in both English and French. I would like to thank Taiwo Afolabi, our moderator, as well as our presenters, Emily Bassard, Elise Boileau, Oliver Mantel, and Alan Brown. I would also like to thank our French interpreters, Merrick Redburn and Christiane Martel, our ASL interpreters, Denica Philpott and Jamie Kwan, as well as our LSQ interpreters, Evian Boulanger-Brière and Hélène Brisebois. We have pasted a link to a survey and we would really appreciate if you could take a few moments to fill it out. Thanks again for attending today's webinar and have a great rest of your day.